In the bustling heart of Nairobi, Major Juma Odhiambo kissed his pregnant wife Zawadi goodbye beneath the flickering streetlight outside their modest apartment. "I promise, I'll be back before our child is born," he whispered, his hand resting on her growing belly. The faint cry of the Matatu horns blended with the distant sounds of a city that never truly sleeps. Zawadi's tear-streaked face was the last image he took with him as his military transport disappeared into the night. Juma's deployment had been bittersweet. While he was determined to serve his country and fulfill his duty as a peacekeeper, the ache of leaving Zawadi and their unborn child gnawed at him. At first, his letters were a lifeline between their worlds, arriving every few weeks. Each one carried vivid descriptions of distant lands and the turmoil they were trying to resolve. He spoke of villages scorched by conflict, children with eyes too old for their age, and the camaraderie of his unit that helped him endure the chaos. Yet, amidst the grim realities of war, his words brimmed with hope for a brighter future, his longing for Zawadi, and the promise to return before their baby's first cries. But as the conflict escalated, the letters became infrequent. At first, Zawadi brushed it off, attributing the delays to the instability of war zones. Yet with each passing week, her anxiety grew, the silence from Juma heavy as a storm cloud. Nights became torturous, spent by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp as she reread his last letter, searching for clues to his fate. Friends and family offered their support, but none could ease the hollow ache of uncertainty. Eventually, months stretched into years, and the once vivid image of Juma's return began to fade from her mind, leaving only a fragile thread of hope that he would keep his promise. However, as the years trudged on and reality set in, Zawadi found herself on the precipice of letting go, her dreams of reunion crumbling under the weight of despair. 4 years dragged by like an eternity for Zawadi, each day bringing its own challenges and heartaches. Left alone to raise her daughter, Amani, she faced a relentless battle to provide for their small family. The small savings Juma had left were soon depleted, forcing Zawadi to juggle multiple jobs. By day, she worked as a receptionist at a local clinic, and by night, she sewed clothes for neighbors to make ends meet. There were times when she skipped meals just to ensure Amani had enough to eat. Despite her sacrifices, there were moments when she felt the crushing weight of failure, particularly on Amani's birthdays when she couldn't afford the things other children had. Emotionally, Zawadi struggled even more. The neighbors whispered, their pity palpable every time they saw her walking alone with her daughter. Some advised her to move on, while others cruelly questioned whether Juma had abandoned her. Nights were the hardest, with loneliness creeping in like a thief as she lay awake, wondering if Juma was alive or if she was holding on to a ghost. Her solace came from telling Amani stories of her father, painting him as a hero who would one day return. But as time passed, even Zawadi started to doubt her words. She would sit by the window some evenings, watching the Nairobi skyline glow in the distance, questioning how long she could hold on to a love that seemed lost to the winds of time. Then, one evening at a friend's gathering, she met Kamau. He was charming, kind, and attentive in a way that Zawadi hadn't experienced in years. Unlike others, he didn't push her to forget Juma or move on. Instead, he listened, truly listened, as she poured out her story. Slowly, Kamau brought laughter back into her life, helping her heal from wounds she didn't realize she carried. He became a steady presence for both her and Amani, and for the first time in years, Zawadi felt as though she could breathe. Kamau didn't replace Juma in her heart, but he filled the void that had been left by years of silence and suffering, giving her hope for a new beginning. Unbeknownst to Zawadi, Juma was alive but barely surviving. His unit had been ambushed after a betrayal orchestrated by his closest friend, Sergeant Maloba. The betrayal had been brewing long before Juma and his unit were even aware of it. Sergeant Maloba, once a trusted friend and ally, had been entangled in secret dealings with local warlords and insurgents. The war-torn country where they were stationed was not just a battlefield, it was also a lucrative black market for weapons, drugs, and minerals. Maloba, seduced by promises of wealth and power, had been approached by a shadowy intermediary representing the enemy. The deal was simple yet sinister: provide critical intelligence about troop movements and supply routes in exchange for a hefty payment and safe passage out of the country. At first, Maloba wrestled with guilt. He remembered the camaraderie he shared with Juma and the rest of the unit, the nights spent around campfires swapping stories, and the shared commitment to their mission. But the temptation was overwhelming. The intermediary painted a picture of a life far removed from the violence and chaos, a life of luxury and ease. Maloba justified his actions, convincing himself that one betrayal wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. After all, wasn't survival the ultimate goal? The fateful night arrived. Maloba handed over the troops' coordinates and a detailed map of their next mission, a supply drop intended to bring relief to a remote village. Unaware of the treachery within their ranks, Juma and his team moved out as planned. The ambush was swift and brutal. Enemy forces, armed with precision intelligence, struck with devastating accuracy. Trucks were overturned, gunfire tore through the air, and soldiers fell one by one. Despite Juma's best efforts to rally his team, they were outgunned and surrounded. The survivors were rounded up, disarmed, and marched to a hidden prison camp deep in the forest. The conditions there were hellish. The air reeked of decay, and the ground was littered with evidence of past captives who hadn't survived. Torture became a daily routine, meant to break their spirits and extract whatever information they might still possess. Juma, as an officer, was subjected to the worst of it, beaten, starved, and subjected to psychological torment. His captors mocked him, saying his suffering was the price of trusting the wrong man. For months, Juma endured the unendurable. He clung to life with sheer willpower, fueled by the thought of Zawadi and the child he had yet to meet. The betrayal by Maloba was a wound that cut deeper than the physical torture. How could someone he considered a brother do this? Yet, amidst the pain, Juma resolved not to let the betrayal define his fate. If he ever made it out of the camp alive, he swore to hold Maloba accountable and return to his family, no matter the cost. In the depths of captivity, as Juma lay on a cold, hard floor with nothing but the distant echoes of his fellow prisoners' groans, his thoughts often wandered back to Zawadi. It was these memories of her, her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of their dreams, that kept him tethered to the world of the living. Despite the brutality of his captors and the relentless physical and psychological torment, Zawadi's face was the one constant in his mind. He remembered the day she had told him she was pregnant, the joy and excitement in her voice as she placed her hand over her growing belly, as though she were already speaking to their unborn child. "I promise, Juma, we will raise this child together," she had said, her voice full of hope. These words haunted him daily, a reminder of what he was fighting for, the life he still had yet to build. At night, when the guards were less attentive, Juma would close his eyes tightly and imagine himself back at their apartment in Nairobi. He could almost feel Zawadi's soft touch, hear the familiar sounds of Amani's laughter, and smell the aroma of her cooking wafting through their home. His mind would replay simple, mundane moments, the way Zawadi would patiently braid his hair, the warmth of her embrace after a long day, the way Amani's tiny hands would grip his finger. In his darkest hours, those memories became his lifeline. He promised himself that no matter the odds, he would return to her and their daughter. He would not let the forces that sought to break him win. Then, one fateful day, everything changed. A riot broke out in the prison. It was chaotic. as the prisoners, driven to the brink of madness by years of abuse, fought back with all the rage they had bottled up inside. The guards were overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the attack, and for the first time since his capture, Juma saw an opportunity. Amidst the confusion, he knew this was his only chance to escape. The camp was poorly guarded in the chaos, and though his body was weak from months of malnutrition and torture, adrenaline surged through his veins. He seized the moment, slipping into the shadows, careful to avoid the heightened chaos around him. Juma ran, the world blurring around him as he moved through the prison gates and into the wild, unforgiving landscape. His mind was a blur, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stop. He pushed himself to keep moving, through the scorching heat of the desert, past rocky outcrops, and through dense forests. He had no map, no food, and only the faintest sense of direction, but his determination burned brighter than ever. He relied on the survival skills he had learned during his training, drinking from streams, foraging for food, and using the stars to navigate. As the days turned into weeks, Juma fought exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. His body, broken from the torture, was a mere shell, yet he kept going. Every step he took brought him closer to home, closer to Zawadi, the family he still dreamt of. He crossed perilous terrains, hiding by day and traveling by night to avoid detection. There were moments when he doubted he would survive, when his legs gave way beneath him, but his thoughts of Zawadi and their child kept him moving forward. The memories of her voice, her words of encouragement, were like a beacon in the darkness. Eventually, after weeks of grueling travel, Juma reached the border. The sight of the familiar terrain, Kenya's red earth and towering trees, filled him with a bittersweet sense of relief. He had made it. He was so close. But even then, his journey was far from over. He still had to make his way to Nairobi, to Zawadi. His body was battered, his clothes torn and caked in dirt, but his heart was stronger than it had ever been. The final leg of his journey would be the hardest, but nothing would stop him now. Juma's promise was still alive, and he would return to the woman he loved, no matter the cost. The man who returned to Nairobi was a shadow of the vibrant, hopeful Juma who had once left for war. His body had been ravaged by years of starvation, brutal torture, and endless suffering. His once strong and athletic frame was now gaunt, his skin a sickly yellowish hue, stretched tight over the bones. His clothes hung loosely from his body, the fabric torn and faded, evidence of the months spent in a prison camp, surviving on nothing but scraps and the occasional drink of water. His face, once proud and full of life, now looked like a mask, hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, and a scraggly beard that seemed to have sprouted in the years of neglect. The weight of his captivity was etched into every line on his face, his posture bent, as if carrying an invisible burden that no one could see but he. He had walked through hell, and it had left its mark on him in ways that no one could ever truly understand. The light in his eyes, once full of hope and promise for a future with his wife and child, had dimmed. There was a coldness in his gaze now, a quiet resignation that spoke of the pain he had endured. In the quiet moments when he was alone, memories of the things he had witnessed, of friends dying in his arms, of the faces of children torn apart by war, of the screams that echoed in the prison camp, played like ghosts in his mind. His soul, once unshakably certain and filled with the promise of a family, had been fractured, and what had replaced it was a man haunted by loss and trauma. The unbreakable resolve he once had seemed shattered, replaced by a deep sorrow that he couldn't shake. He wasn't the man who had left Nairobi all those years ago. He was someone different, someone who had been tested in ways he hadn't been prepared for. When Juma reached their apartment building, every step felt like a dream, as if his feet were moving on autopilot. He could hardly believe he had made it this far, yet something gnawed at him, a subtle unease that grew as he approached the entrance. The familiar apartment building loomed before him, but something was wrong. Something had changed. He paused for a moment, his heart pounding as his tired eyes fell upon the balcony of their apartment. There, hanging carelessly on the railing, was another man's coat. The sight sent a sharp pang through his chest, a jolt that ripped through the numbness that had settled in his soul. It wasn't just the coat. It was the implication. It was a symbol of someone who had stepped into his place, someone who had taken his life while he had been locked away, struggling to survive. The thought of Zawadi and Kamal flooded his mind, and his heart twisted with a complex mixture of jealousy, guilt, and sorrow. Was Zawadi waiting for him, or had she moved on, as life demanded of her in his absence? Had she found someone else to fill the role he had left vacant for so long? The coat was a painful reminder that time had not stood still for him while he had been trapped in that hellish prison. He had been away for 4 years, 4 years of torture and loss, while Zawadi had been left behind to navigate life without him, raising their daughter alone. The coat on the balcony was a symbol of the time that had passed, of the life that had continued without him. It was a painful reminder that things had changed, that he wasn't the same man who had left. And yet, despite all the pain, despite the scars, he knew he had to face whatever awaited him inside. Juma took a deep breath and straightened his back, though every inch of him screamed in exhaustion. This was it. His promise had been kept. But what would he find when he walked through that door? Juma stood at the doorway, his voice trembling, raw from the years of silence and the heavy burden of his ordeal. Zawadi, I kept my promise. I'm here. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like a lifeline thrown after years of drowning. But as soon as they left his lips, a deep and agonizing silence filled the space between them. His eyes searched her face for recognition, for the spark of the love they had once shared. Yet, what he saw in her eyes was not just the joy he had hoped for, but something far more complicated, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a deep, unreadable sorrow. Zawadi stood frozen, her body caught between the past and the present, between the life she had lost and the one she had been forced to build. The woman who had waited for him, for all these years, now found herself standing before a man who was no longer the Juma she had loved. His body was a living testament to the horrors he had endured, his face gaunt and haunted. It was as though the years of separation, the endless waiting, had created a chasm between them that neither could easily cross. Zawadi's heart ached at the sight of him, the man she had loved, and the father of her child, yet the person standing before her seemed like a stranger. The warmth and hope that had once radiated from him were gone, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. In the years without him, Zawadi had learned to survive without the love she had clung to so desperately. She had found comfort in Kamal, and though her feelings for him weren't the same as what she had once shared with Juma, he had become her pillar in the absence of the man she had thought lost forever. Her gaze flickered to the balcony again, where the coat still hung. A silent reminder of the life she had built, of the choices she had made in Juma's absence. Was it possible to love 2 men at once? Or had she truly moved on, as much as she had tried to convince herself otherwise? The storm of emotions that swelled within her, guilt, longing, confusion, and resentment, threatened to drown her. How could she turn away the man who had promised to return to her? Yet how could she ignore the new life she had fought so hard to create? Juma's presence demanded a reckoning, a confrontation with all the pain of the past and the realities of the present. And in the silence between them, the weight of 4 years of uncertainty crushed her chest. Meanwhile, in the shadows of Nairobi's streets, Sergeant Maloba's world had collapsed around him. His treachery, once an act driven by greed and ambition, had unleashed a whirlwind of consequences he hadn't fully anticipated. Word of his betrayal had reached the highest ranks of their military commanders, and the price for his actions was steep. His former comrades, the men he had once fought beside, now saw him as a traitor, a man who had sold out his brothers for a handful of coins. The consequences of his actions were swift and brutal. His face was now plastered on wanted posters, and he was marked for execution by the very forces he had once allied with. Fleeing through the back alleys of the city, Maloba could barely recognize the world he now inhabited. The wealth and promises he had been offered had turned to ash in his hands. His betrayal had cost him everything: his position, his comrades, and his honor. The very people he had once trusted with his life were now hunting him, vowing vengeance for the pain he had caused. He had thought he could control the situation, manipulate the enemy and his friends to secure his future, but he had underestimated the loyalty of the men he had sold out and the unforgiving nature of those he had wronged. Now Maloba was a fugitive, constantly looking over his shoulder, never knowing when his past would catch up with him. The consequences of his greed had made him a hunted man, and his soul, like Juma's, was scarred by the actions that could never be undone. For Zawadi, the turmoil was unbearable. The woman who had once stood strong in her love for Juma was now caught between the shards of that love and the reality of a life she had never intended to build without him. And Juma, the man she had waited for, now faced the impossible task of healing the wounds he had carried back from the war, while confronting the life Zawadi had forged in his absence. The man who had returned was not the same man who had left, and Zawadi's heart was torn between the past she could never forget and the future that was now uncertain. As for Maloba, the consequences of his betrayal loomed large, and there was no place where he could hide from the guilt and fear that would ultimately claim him. The storm of emotions and retribution had only just begun, and the ripples of their actions would echo far beyond their control. In the days that followed, Juma's return to Nairobi felt like the beginning of a slow, painful rebirth. Each day, he tried to reclaim the life he had lost, but it was harder than he had imagined. His body, battered and frail, could barely keep up with the demands of rebuilding a future. The emotional scars were even more painful than the physical ones. He knew that regaining Zawadi's trust, and more importantly, winning back her heart, would be an arduous journey. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, felt like a fragile attempt to reconnect with the woman he had once known. But she was different now, more guarded, more distant. 4 years of pain, of uncertainty, had changed her, and in some ways, it had changed him too. His relationship with Amani, however, was even more complicated. He had missed her first steps, her first words, and all the milestones that a father should have been there for. Now, she was a young girl, almost a stranger to him. The bond between them, which should have been natural, felt strained. Amani, though she had been raised on stories of her father, was understandably cautious. She didn't know this broken man who stood before her, this man with hollow eyes and a sadness that seemed too deep to overcome. When Juma tried to hold her, she pulled away, unsure of how to reconcile the image of her father from Zawadi's stories with the reality of this man who had returned from the shadows. Juma spent hours trying to earn her trust. He would sit with her, telling her stories of when she was a baby, of the dreams he once had of their family. But Amani, in her quiet way, kept a distance. She wanted to love her father, to believe that the man who had left her mother all those years ago was still the same. But her heart was torn. She was just a child, after all, and the emotional complexities of her parents' separation were beyond her. Yet, every time Juma reached out, every small step she took toward him filled him with hope. Slowly, day by day, a bond began to form between them. It was fragile, like a bird's nest perched precariously on a branch. But it was there. Kamau, watching the slow and steady development of Juma's relationship with Amani, felt a heavy ache in his chest. For all the kindness he had shown to Zawadi, for all the support he had given her during Juma's absence, he couldn't ignore the growing reality that this was not the life he had envisioned. Kamau had come to love Zawadi, not in the way Juma had, but in a quieter, more patient way. He had been there for her through the hardest times, and when she had seemed to give up hope, it was Kamau who had steadied her. He had been the one to laugh with Amani, to help her with her homework, to fill the void left by Juma's absence. But watching Zawadi with Juma now, seeing the way they shared soft looks and tentative touches, he felt a pang of something painful. The love between them, though not as immediate or unspoken as before, was undeniable. He couldn't deny that they were finding each other again, piece by fragile piece. Kamau also saw how Amani's hesitation with Juma slowly began to fade. Every time she called him Dad, tentatively at first, then with more certainty, Kamau felt the weight of the shift. A father was returning to his place in Amani's heart, and no matter how much Kamau cared for her, he knew that he could never replace that. There were moments when he watched Juma sit on the porch with Amani, telling her stories of his life in the military, of his survival, and slowly, Kamau could see the walls between them begin to crumble. Amani's small smile, the way she clung to Juma's hand during their walks, all signaled that she was reconnecting with her father in ways Kamau could never have imagined. The ache in Kamau's heart grew deeper with each passing day. He had given Zawadi the space to heal, to find a new path after the devastation of losing Juma. But he realized, as he watched their reunion unfold, that the man Zawadi had been waiting for had returned, and no matter how much Kamau cared for her, he was not the one she had dreamed of. Their love was built on kindness, patience, and understanding, but it wasn't the same kind of love that had once burned so fiercely between Zawadi and Juma. Kamau knew that Zawadi's heart, as much as she cared for him, had always belonged to Juma. And watching the two of them rekindle their bond, seeing the way Zawadi looked at Juma now with a tenderness that was both new and familiar, Kamau understood that he had to step aside. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the soft hum of the city filled the air, Kamau found himself alone with Zawadi. The weight of the decision pressed on him like a stone, but it was a decision that had been building in his heart for weeks. He looked at Zawadi, at the woman who had been his strength, the woman he had once hoped to build a future with. Zawadi, he began, his voice soft but resolute. I think it's time for me to go. Juma, he needs you and Amani needs him. You both need to rebuild what was lost. I don't belong in the space between you two anymore. Zawadi's eyes widened in surprise, a mixture of sorrow and understanding in her gaze. Kamau, I know you care for me, Kamau interrupted gently, but I've seen how you look at him, how Amani is coming back to him. This is what's right for all of you. I will always care for you, but this is your family, and I won't stand in the way of that. With a heavy heart, Kamau turned and walked away, leaving Zawadi standing in the doorway. He felt the weight of his decision, but there was no turning back. As painful as it was, Kamau knew it was the only way forward for all of them. And as he left, he could only hope that one day they would understand why he had made the sacrifice. He had given them a chance to heal, and sometimes love meant letting go. As Juma healed, he vowed to bring Maloba to justice, not just for himself, but for the comrades they had lost. His journey was not just one of revenge, but redemption. Zawadi, torn between the past and the future, rediscovered the strength of their love. In the end, the story wasn't just about war or betrayal, but the resilience of the human spirit and the power of family.